I lost the thread. I can sort of reinvent it, but if I said that to you, I must have had a very specific thing in mind. If somebody could, somebody's got a TV on in the background or something. If you could hit mute or
Oh,
whatever.
oh, oh.
Yeah. So Brad, let me try to remember that because I've lost the thread of our conversation. I
That's
apologize.
okay.
Okay. So are you okay? So are you seeing where it says Michael Bornstein up here? No?
Yes.
Okay. So this is actually a note from the edition that I have, the edition of the book that I have, and it's a note that's sort of more general than just Keter, but so I wanted to share it with you because I think that it's illuminating. The notes are excellent in this book, and I wanted just to share it with you. So this is a note that he has towards the beginning of the chapter. It's not quite the introduction to the chapter, but it's towards the beginning, and I thought it was worth reading together. So why doesn't somebody read this for us? Lenny, will you read this?
I have to wait till all these, okay. The essence of the Sephira is called Keter, and its existence is concealed, and it cannot be known by another, but only its emanation alone.
Let's pause there for 1 second. Sorry. So remember, we got into this last week, this idea that Keter's unknowability. And so when we talk about aspects of, when we talk about Keter, we're talking about its emanation. It's hard to translate the word, but I think what he means by that is we can sense its sort of distant, remote effects, but its essence is sort of really, really beyond us. So that's what he's saying. Okay, keep going.
We have only its name. It can be compared to the crown of a king. All the people can see the crown up his head.
Sorry, upon his head, my bad.
On his head. and from this they understand that he is king, but they understand his sovereignty that rules over them.
So in other words, they comprehend that he's a king, that he's their king, but they only understand it through his sovereignty. They only understand it through his power, and he'll explain in what way that's a limited understanding. Okay. Sorry. Keep going.
This is the Midah of Malchut, or they can see his body, literally limbs, like his right hand with which he does mercy, or the left with which is the hand of severity. But his chokhmah, wisdom, and his bina, understanding, they cannot comprehend. But they can understand which side is being received through his words or deeds.
Okay, pause here for a second. So what he's trying to do with this analogy is he's trying to and it gets a little bit artificial, as you'll see, but he's trying to make a distinction. There are aspects that we can readily see. We can see, like, imagine he raises his right hand, and with that right hand, he says, everyone will have a free meal for a year, or, we'll all celebrate together this coming weekend, or all those who are poor come to the palace to receive gifts, whatever it might be. They see him as waving his hand. They see the effects of his mercy. And those things are less concealed. But his chokhmah and his bina, and so the reason I translated them literally here, even though I've warned you against translating the names of the Sefirot literally, is because here it's an analogy to an actual flesh and blood king. They don't understand his thinking, they don't understand his reasoning, they don't understand his deep designs for the kingdom, but they just sort of see the effects of the left side and the right side. So there's differing levels of comprehension they have. But the crown itself, keep going.
But the crown itself, which is the essential part of his kingship, this is to be comprehended only by the king. It cannot be comprehended by any other. Only by his powers that flow from him can he be comprehended, but not by the crown of the king himself.
So this is where the analogy a little bit breaks down because, in truth, the crown is not really the essence of kingship. If a king's crown is destroyed, the person is still king. But you can imagine, like what it's like to wear the crown and what it's like to be the king. Nobody else can really understand what that's like. We see the results of the kingship. We see the results of God, of the sovereignty, but the essence of what is behind the king's imagination and motivations which is symbolized by the crown, are concealed from us. And so I wanted just to share that. I thought it was a useful analogy, as a way of making differentiations about the different levels, um, of the Sfirot, and about Keter. So Keter's nature is unknowable, but Malchut we can see by the effects of it in the world, and we know that the effects in the world have their root in Keter. Um, and so, but we will never see that Keter. We'll never truly understand it. It's beyond our comprehension. Okay, so I wanted to share that with you. Um, I wanted to also say, with regard to Keter, um, I wanted to say that, um, so Tiferet is known as the realm of Rachamim, okay, of mercy. And Keter is known as Rachamim Gemorim, which means complete mercy. Okay, so what is the distinction between these two things? Well, remember that Tiferet is sort of the realm. One of the ways to look at Tiferet is the realm of the dispensation of justice, or the proper ordering of the world, and it is filled with mercy, but it is not completely a world of mercy. So one way to look at that by way of an analogy, all of us, there are consequences for our actions. And so you may have done things in your life and you've borne the consequences of those things, but maybe you've learned from them. You're still here to reflect on them. You've grown through those consequences. And so the fact that you had a consequence demonstrates that there's there's judgment mixed in. But the fact that you're still here and you've grown through that is the sign of rachamim, and of mercy, of compassion. And there's more rachamim than din, when the world is properly ordered. Looked at another way, so now letting go of the analogy, or I should say, using a different lens than the lens of judgment. Remember that we talked about the fact, many times we've talked about the fact that din is judgment, but it's also just delineation. So we live in a world where, where there are boundaries and differentiations, and there's you and there's me, and that world has pain within it, right? It's to live is to experience suffering, at least in part. But the Kabbalah affirms that on balance, there's more blessing and goodness and harmony in the world than there is differentiation and suffering. So even though we all know suffering and we go through periods of our lives in which there seems to be way too much of it, overall, the world, even when we don't experience it like this, even when we don't feel like this, the world is actually filled with harmony and beauty and goodness, more so than it is with judgment and pain and suffering. And at times of great despair, that can be a hard thing to affirm, but that's an affirmation of the Kabbalah, that in spite of all of the difficulties and pain in the world, On balance, the nature of the world is beauty and harmony. That outweighs Din. How do we know that? Well, one of the ways that really the way we know that is that the world is still here, right? If the world was just operating by Din, it would have destroyed itself. So I don't know, and it would have just completely fallen apart, and we would be in a state of constant warfare, and the nature of the world would really be destruction. And I don't know if you've heard that there's a midrash that talks about the angels are talking about different attributes on which the world can be founded, and it's God's initial intention, I believe, if I recall the midrash correctly. There's a bunch of different midrashim like this. It's God's initial intention to found the world on perfect justice, and there's a logic to that, right? You do good, you're rewarded with good. You do bad, you're punished. And then God discovers that the world cannot survive if it's just pure justice. And so God brings in rachamim. God brings in mercy and forgiveness so that the world can obtain, and so that the created beings can kind of figure it out and be forgiven. So we live in a world where there's an abundance of rachamim, but in which judgment and delineation still exists. So that world is sort of represented by Tiferet, and that's why we refer to Tiferet as Rachamim. So let me pause there before I go on, because I'm sure parts of what I just said are confusing, if not all of it. So if you have a question, now's a great time to ask it. I'm dealing with enlightened beings. I love it. You guys are like...
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
The idea of the original, God originally wants to create the world with Din only. But where does that come from? Is that in Gates of Light itself, or
No.
is that?
No, that's a midrash. That's a midrash that in other words, much older, probably, around the year 200 BCE. The midrash, some of the midrashim, maybe a little bit later than that. And but what's interesting though, I guess the reason I shared it is because this is really just sort of a footnote to the conversation. Many times I've found that there are midrashim that are very well known, or at least known to people who study this stuff a lot, and you've never seen them through a Kabbalistic light, and then the Kabbalah comes to sort of shed light on them, and it brings a new understanding to it. And so this midrash is one that is used a lot in the Kabbalah to talk about the importance of the attribute of rachamim and to explain it. And to explain why it is that we would have a midrash that teaches us about God's initial attempt to create the world, and so we can kind of comprehend by comparison what it is to live in a world of rachamim. Okay, other questions about?
Question.
Yeah.
Question. So, and maybe this goes towards the structure of the diagram of the Sefirot. So Gevurah is Din, Chesed, because Tiferet's kind of in the middle. So is that because it's like the Gevurah, the Din is on one side, and Chesed, which I guess, I don't know, you always hear different meanings. I guess it means mercy. Both flow into Tiferet, but you said Tiferet is actually mercy, but it's a combination because it's not as good as Keter, which is pure.
Right.
Pure
yeah.
mercy.
So here's I just Wikipedia the Tree of Life thing. And so this is the Wikipedia entry on the Tree of Life. Yeah. So from the top, Keter, Chochma, Bina, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. Now, and then Malchut. Tiferet is right in the middle, but remember that Tiferet is holding in balance all of these others. Right, Tiferet is holding in balance so Tiferet is represented by the Vav of the four-letter name of God, and remember that Vav has a numerical value of 6, And the reason that's important is not because I'm trying to confuse you with gematria, but because Tiferet is actually contains a total of 6 sfirot within it. Tiferet, Chesed, Gevura, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. So anyway, Tiferet is balancing all of these, but the primary, Joel, to your point, the primary way that we usually talk about Tiferet is that it's the force that balances Chesed and Gevura.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And so Chesed is like pure loving kindness, Gevura is pure deen, and Tiferet allows a balance to exist between them.
And it's the Vav, but it counts as one of the 6 because it has the 5 around it.
Yeah,
And so-
exactly.
okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So Tiferet is Rachamim, but it is not Rachamim Gamorim, which means complete or perfect Rachamim, because it has judgment mixed within it. And Keter is Rachamim Gamorim, complete Rachamim, complete mercy. And what's interesting about that, and I'll give you a verse that Jikatilia brings to kind of illustrate this. And it's a nice verse because it sort of works on it sort of helps you understand the Peshat as well as giving you a really deep understanding of Keter. But just knowing that Keter is like the first step in the creation of the world, right? It's like the first emanation from God's true nature, which is Ein Sof. Keter is in some way that we can't really understand, is like the beginning of the inkling of the creation, the first seed of creation, and that is complete mercy. So the essential nature of the world that we live in, its essential nature is complete compassion and mercy and love. And I think we talked about last time how different this is from when we read Judaism through the eyes of Christian polemics about Judaism, or just the readings of those who don't really understand Judaism as a tradition and only know parts of the Torah, and they see a jealous God, and the God of justice, and the God who gets angry, and sometimes Jews get very upset about this, but like, fair enough, you read the Tanakh and like there's that God is very present, but it's not the way the rabbinic tradition and not the way the Kabbalistic tradition reads God. So in fact, God is a God of pure love, but for the world to stand, things have to get more complicated. So Keter, which is the primary impulse for the creation of the world and the creation of created beings, is actually Rachamim Gemorim, full and complete Rachamim, and I'll get you in 1 second, which then begs us to ask the question, then it begs the question, well, how in the world that we have, how can the core of it be Rachamim Gemorim? How can the foundation of the world be unadulterated mercy, perfect compassion, and goodness? And that gets to a bigger picture, which is not fully addressed by Jikatilia, that we don't really have a language for until we get to the Kabbalah of the Ari, of the Arizal, of Yitzhak Luria, who begins to talk about the purpose of creation and the way in which we as human beings fit into the purpose of creation. But ultimately, the purpose of creation in the eyes of the later Kabbalah is for human beings to experience the fullness of blessing that comes from serving God and comes from unifying with and cleaving to God. That was God's primal impulse for the creation of the world, was to allow created beings to experience that pleasure of a life of coming close to God. And Paul.
Is there another midrash or a conversation about that midrash that imagines a world that started first with the Rachamim and then had to add the Din?
Oh, I don't think so. It's a really good question. I don't think so. So you're saying like
Like
account.
stay up all night and think about how those two worlds would be different from each other.
Right. So let's, right. So so I had said there was a world that existed before our world that was just Dean and it destroyed itself. And you're asking, is there a counterpart to that midrash where we imagine that there was a world made just out of chesed? So it's a great question. I don't know the answer, but let's talk about for a moment, let's assume there's not that midrash. Can we anybody try to draw on what we've learned in this class and explain why there couldn't be a world that was just based in chesed?
Well, does it have something to do with the lack of distinction, meaning that there wouldn't be you and me, that
Right.
we would all be one?
Right. That's what I'm thinking. Right. When we say world, what we mean by world is, delineation and differences. Like there's this thing and there's that thing and there's up and there's down. Before there's distinctions, which is the world of Dean, that doesn't exist. So that's why I don't think that midrash exists. And again, we talked about this a lot when we talked about Dean, but that is the Jewish way of saying that to be in that on some level the nature of existence is suffering, right? I mean, I'm deliberately drawing on Buddhist language, but that is, the world cannot exist without separation, and separation causes suffering because it's not like our truest essence of what we want to be.
So is that rachamim then, that pure rachamim, the essence that was Hashem before, with what the withdrawing part,
Right. That's right. So it draws on that. So the tzimtzum was I think what you mean by the shrinking part, right? The yes, so Tiferet Rachamim is drawing on that primal compassion, pure compassion that is Keter, right? So Keter flows through everything, but in particular, it flows through Tiferet, and Tiferet's drawing on the pure Rachamim, and it's bringing it to balance the Din. So Rachamim was necessary. So once Din was created, once Din existed and there was differentiation, then Rachamim was necessary to sort of keep the whole thing from destroying itself, with like centripetal force. And so that's Rachamim. But Rachamim Gemorim is the true nature of the world. Well, I mean, I guess I should say it was the foundational impulse of creation that's still there. But remember that we don't really get to taste that except through certain moments. We sense its presence. The reason we don't get to taste Rachamim Gemorim, unadulterated Rachamim, is because we live in the world of differentiation. But there are moments when we can taste what it would be like to transcend that. And that is when he brings this verse from Exodus. So let me share this with you. Okay, so the verse that he uses to illustrate this idea of Rachamim Gemorim is this. So Vayomer ani a'avir kol tov'i al panecha v'karati v'shem yudhe vavhe lefanecha v'chanoti et asher achon v'richamti et asher arachem. So let's see. Joel Greenbaum, can you read this in the English here? This what I have highlighted.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Any answer? I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name Lord and the grace that I grant and the compassion that I show.
Okay, so this is a terrible translation, which I did not realize well when I copied and pasted this, because I was just reading it in the English. It is 1 second here. I will be, give me a second, gracious to those to whom I am gracious, and compassionate to those to whom I am compassionate. Okay, so okay, so this is when Moses is up on Moses is talking to God, and Moses wants to know God's nature, and God says, well, you can't really know me perfectly. You can't really know my truest essence. And what's God's phrase that God says that kind of captures that nobody can really see that? Anybody remember? It becomes important later in this chapter. God says, no person sees my face and lives. Okay, and that's going to become important, as we'll see. So nobody can really, and by the way, I've mentioned this, well, we'll get to it. So so I will make all of my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And then he says, I will be gracious to those to whom I am gracious, and compassionate to those who I am compassionate. And so our author, Chikatilia, uses this verse as an illustration of the idea of Rachamim Gemorim. And I think that what he has in mind, I think the reason he uses this verse is, I think actually there are two, at least two, that I understand. One is what I already said, because God says in the context of this conversation, it's not quoted here, that no person can see my face and live. And as I said, we'll come back to that, but at a minimum, it means you can't really know me. You can't really understand Keter, and you can't really unify with Ein Sof, which is beyond Keter. So that's one reason. And then the other reason is that there's a little bit of a, and this is where I was saying earlier that I think that the Kabbalistic reading helps illustrate the Pshat, is very strange language. When God says, V'chanoti et asher achon, I will be gracious to those to whom I am gracious. There's a little bit of a sense here of like, it's not a question of, I will be gracious to those who deserve my grace, and I will be compassionate to those who deserve my compassion. It's just sort of like, I'm going to be gracious and compassionate to whomever. Right? There's a sense of unlimited grace and compassion that God is saying that's part of who I am. And sometimes you can't look to try to understand why that is happening. And that can, by the way, in our experience of the world, that can be a source of both inspiration and hope, and also a source of incredible frustration and pain. Because to look at this, to a little bit of a departure, Cheryl, I see you have your hand raised. Give me one sec. A little bit of a departure, but like many characters in the Torah. So think about Job, and also in the Talmud. If we think so, we think of. We studied this in last week's Torah portion. The rabbi that we call Acher in the Torah, the rabbi who saw suffering in the world and couldn't handle it. And sort of left the fold. Well, the other side of that is seeing those who do evil seemingly go unpunished in the world, right? And the persistence of people who do evil, and they're allowed to live. Like, why doesn't God just strike them down? And to live in the world means that we have to live with a world that is not just, at least the way we understand it, because God seems to offer forgiveness and compassion in a kind of unlimited way that plays out in the world, that's in a way that's very painful and difficult for us to understand, that almost seems arbitrary. Hold on, Cheryl, and then Joel.
Okay. I had two thoughts. One is, we'll be gracious to, could you put the page back up?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So that I will be gracious to those whom I am gracious, and compassionate to those whom I am compassionate. Seems like an extension of Eyar Sher Yeah, I will
Mhm.
be what I will be.
Mm-hmm.
Is kind of divided. And then I was having some fun, which might not have been accurate fun, about looking at in the Hebrew, because of this. Let's see if I can put there. Is
Avir, yeah.
that where it says "I'll pass through you"? Isn't that also a word? It's kind of a boundary word. It's like I will transgress or I
Yeah.
will trespass.
Yeah.
And so some here in this statement, it's almost like even for you to have any idea of this, even for me to do my very best to show myself, I'm already, there's some division that's going on.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, right. Because the root of it, what Cheryl's getting at is the root ayin bet resh is also the root of the word avera, which is a word for sin. Obviously, the verb has many different meanings, but yeah, it means to transgress or to cross over. And here it means like I will cross over before you or pass before you. That's interesting. That's interesting. I like that. There, I'll say that's a really nice creative reading. Joel. Oh, sorry, Joel. Before you go, I wanted to say to the first part, Cheryl, of what you said. There is something about Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, that God's true, when God reveals God's name, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. Remember that the word Ehyeh, and this is I think what Cheryl's alluding to, the name Ehyeh is the name that Jikatilia associates with Keter, right? Ehyeh means I will be. I will be that I will be is the way it's often translated. And so Cheryl's saying there's some connection here between, I will do what I want in a way that you won't understand, and God's essence, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And I think that's a really sharp perception. And Jikatilia talks about the nature of the name Ehyeh, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Joel, go ahead.
So it sounds like this is supposed to represent unboundless goodness, but when I read it in the English, it's almost like, I don't know. The first thing that I thought of was it's gonna be like a tease. I'm gonna pass all my goodness before you, so you're gonna know, like somehow you're just gonna see that, oh my God, God is just so good and all encompassing. But I'll be gracious to those whom I'm gracious and compassionate to those whom I'm compassionate. But I'm gonna dole it out to whoever and whenever I kind of please.
Right.
I see it as kind of a limiting statement.
Right. Right.
It's kind of like I'm not going to be good to everybody here. I'll be good when I'm good.
Right. 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 It's not, rather than saying I'll just pour it out boundlessly.
With goodness and merciful.
Right. Yep. Right. I think that's a fair question to ask. And if Jikatili were around, I would also want to ask him that question. Right. On some level, it's unsatisfying, but not but as I'm now going to refute that, but just a way to deepen our understanding of this is, remember we talked last time, no, I didn't write it out, but we talked last time about the idea that he addresses, he brings up in this chapter, which is that when the Israelites were in Egypt, they didn't merit salvation. Right? According to Jikatilia, in his reading of the Torah, if you had just kind of counted up like all of Israel's merits, like where it was spiritually and what kind of people they had become under the suffering versus what they might have become under their suffering, their salvation was not earned. And then there's a whole discourse about what happened to Israel, the Israelites in Egypt, the ways in which they were sort of through trauma or whatever you want to say, they became so spiritually upside down that they kind of shrank morally. And it was not through some incredible achievement of overcoming that God said, oh, this people has merited salvation, but rather it was through, Jikatilia says, through Keter, It was like, yeah, this people's a mess. They're selfish. They've internalized the mores of their society. They're materialistic. They're even in their suffering, they're materialistic. They're idolatrous. They're cruel to each other. Remember that Moses sees like an Israelite beating an Israelite. They're completely messed up. So I can't say, God says, I can't say that they merit salvation and redemption, but nonetheless, I'm going to redeem them. And remember that the name that God shares with Moses that starts the Geula, that starts the redemption, is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And so that is, I will be that I will be. Because remember, Moses says, hey, at least tell me your name so I know who's redeeming them. So, because they're going to ask me, who is this God that's going to redeem us? And essentially, God says, I am Keter. That is, there's no reason that could justify this. I'm just reaching out of incredible, abundant mercy that's unmerited, because I will be gracious to whom I'm gracious and compassionate to whom I'm compassionate, and I will redeem them. And now I want to link that. And Mickey, did you have your hand up? I'll get you in one sec if you did. I want to link that to what Cheryl said. So Ehyeh, so the God, well, let me look at it this way. So we say of God, hu haya, hu hoveh, hu yihiyeh. God was, God is, God will be. And the haya and hoveh, we can be aware of, we can understand to some extent, right? We look back in the past, and if we're the kind of people who are inclined to see God in our lives, or who are open to perceiving God in our lives, we can look to the past and say, oh, I see an order to my life, or a spiritual growth, or a healing from trauma, or a tikkun that was made in my life as I went from there to there. Or we look back on the miracle of the existence of the Jewish people, and we say, as some people say, there had to be something at work there to allow the Jewish people to still be here. Whatever it is. So that's Adonai Haya, that God was. And in the Hoveh, it's a little more challenging, but we can see God as a force of presence in our lives, in the present. Not something you're ever going to prove to anyone, but we can perceive God's existence in the world. But the God that will be, that is understanding what God is going to do and the reasons for God will do those things in the future, that's unknowable to us. We can't understand what God will do, because the future is hidden from human beings. Ehyeh, which is a future tense name, I will be, that's God, that's the Keter name. The future is by its nature concealed from us. Nobody here knows what's going to happen over the course of this conversation, or tomorrow, or whatever. And so the future tense aspect of that name reflects the hiddenness of Keter. So that's part of the reason that's the name of Keter. Does that make sense? Mickey, did you have a hand up?
I just thinking that's really a discouraging way to look at life. What's the point of doing good? What's the point of praising God, being good to your neighbor? Because it's random. You don't really know. So I just think that's not a great thing. And what also comes to me is, how do you square that with the second paragraph of Shema, which seems to say just the opposite? If you do this, your crops will grow. You'll do well if you follow me. Blah 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 blah. So how do you square those two things? I guess that's it.
I love your translation of that second paragraph there. The blah 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 blah. I think that's in the Sim Shalom, but not the Art Scroll. But so what I wanted to say about that, I think it's a really great question, and I think it's something that all of us really, that people wrestle with, whether they know these texts or not. What we all know. So I'm going to sort of riff on what you're saying. You're saying, like, that's a discouraging idea, right? Like, if you could choose, so what I'm going to say is, if I could choose the kind of God that I would want in the world, I might choose a God that would, like, when I do something good, good things happen. And when I do something bad, bad things happen. And that I would want it to be consistent and predictable. That's how I would want the world to be. Well, the world we have is the world we have, and we don't get to choose how it is. And so, yeah, that's deeply painful. That's deeply painful sometimes.
Right. That's the world we have. But if you look at it from the other side of that coin,
Mm-hmm.
well, if this is the world we have, if this is the world we have, where goodness doesn't merit any reward, where there's no real reason to be good, what's the point? Let me just, do whatever I want, screw people, cheat, rob,
Yep. Right.
because it's random.
Yeah. Yep. Now listen, so I think that's right. And so I'm going to and I want to stay on this for a minute because I think it's actually very, very important because, look, I think that all of us go through periods where we say, you know what, that is the nature of the world. This doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I do. And that's both heartbreaking and, dare I say it, like liberating, right? I don't have to lift a finger to help anybody because I'm not going to get punished for not doing that. Or I can go out and do whatever I want, and there's not going to be any consequence. Like we all have liberated ourselves, at least in moments of our lives, and sometimes in long stretches of our lives, understanding that there don't seem to be personal consequences for all kinds of bad stuff. So I'm not going to try to dissuade you from that and pretend that the world is made out of perfect justice, because it's not. So then the question is, how do we respond to that reality? And that's a reality that we know has, we're not talking about something trifling here. We're talking about something that has caused a huge amount of pain and suffering and trauma, right? That we just can't make sense of our world, and it causes us to do all kinds of crazy things, and it causes us to lead lives of selfishness because we can. And every single human being is implicated in this. And so, but and I don't have the perfect answer, but I will say that one of the ways, since you mentioned the V'ahavta, so the second paragraph of the V'ahavta, which talks about consequences, one of the ways that the V'ahavta is sometimes understood is that the ideal relationship to God is captured in the first paragraph. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. You shall love Hashem your God all the time, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. Not because you're going to get a reward, not because it helps you avoid punishment, just love, pure love. That's what we owe to God. But sometimes human beings can't really get there. And then we offer the possibility that, you know what, a life in which you're serving God is going to be better for you. Maybe it won't be literally like in the second paragraph of the Shema, where like you get everything you want whenever you do good, but on balance, a life serving God is going to just be better for you. And that's kind of the second paragraph of the Shema. And sometimes we need to sort of resort to that, but really what we want to be is serving God even without regard to the consequences. And I think, Mickey, what I would say is that one of the things that the Kabbalah does is that it challenges us to develop a love of God that is without regard to consequences. But I hear what you're saying. Cheryl and then Lenny.
Just like this other really striking paradox in there, because we're talking about God being fair. Where you use the words as this is pure deen, and we've already learned from our story that the world can't exist with pure deen.
Right.
So
That's right.
Somewhere there's some mercy coming into the fact that the world isn't fair.
Yeah.
And,
Now that's another great answer, Mickey. So I don't know if you got that, but like what you're talking about is a world of deen. Like if the world really was ruled by justice, I could be motivated to do good because I knew there were rewards for doing good and punishment for doing bad. But if it's not like that, I don't who cares? And that's why we say we live in a world of rachamim of mercy, and that consequence of that is that it doesn't always add up in terms of justice. Sometimes there's an arbitrariness to rachamim. And I think that the opportunity is to see ourselves as beneficiaries of that, right? Like thank God, I would say for me, for Josh Rose, thank God that the world is not based on strict justice, because I have not put into it what I've gotten out of it. And if suddenly the accounts were drawn up, I would be in serious trouble. And I would, I would have some kind of burden that I would have to pay with my life. But the rachamim of the world gives me the opportunity for teshuva and keeps me around to give me another opportunity to serve God in a proper way. Lenny?
I'm going to have to really disagree with you on this, and I'm kind of surprised that you're taking this approach to this problem. And the reason I disagree is that when you wake up in the morning, unless you're taking like a lot of LSD or something, there's all this stuff with Charlie Manson now, and you wake up and say, there's no good, there's no bad, everything is open, and I'm a free being. It's just not, you get up in the morning and you have to start making decisions, right? And it's those decisions that define what your life is going to be. And if you stray outside those, maybe you'll make some money, or maybe you'll be successful, or maybe all of those different things will happen for you, but they weren't the right decisions. At least if you make the right decisions, you can live with the fact that at least you made the right decisions. How else? What other criteria do you actually have to move forward on? That's to me the normative part of Judaism, as opposed to that kind of cosmic New Age stuff that I suffered under for so many years, that somehow there was some larger picture, but it never did anything for me or the world. So I just leave it at that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure
I'm
what.
missing the essence of what you're saying.
Yeah. So again, I'm hearing noise in the background. I don't know if somebody's got, or maybe it's just the sound of us echoing. If you're not speaking, can you just put yourself on mute? Because I don't know, somebody's got noise going on. So, Lenny, I'm not sure what part of what I said you're responding to, because that would just help me know how to respond. I'm certainly not, and I assume you know this, but I was not proposing as a moral compass the mentality that I was describing. I was saying it's easy to fall into a mentality, and I'm saying that we all do, where we get away with knowing that that there's no reward for goodness, and there's no punishment for badness, and there's no punishment for acting badly. And I'm just saying, I think it's natural for us to fall into that as an excuse for passivity. Like, here's an example. I don't feel satisfied in what I have done at this moment of awakening in our country as we contemplate racial justice, for example. Look, granted, nobody knows the answer, but if I make a list of things that I have done, is how can I at this moment of awakening contribute? I realize I've gotten away with knowing that, what, I guess I'll I've spent a lot of time this summer with my family and doing my own thing and kind of tuning out the world. I'm not proud of that, but there's part of my Yetzer Hara that knows that I can get away with that. So I'm saying that that's a reality of human life, but I'm not saying that's what we ought to be doing.
Well, I think that the part that I'm approaching, and because I know that you're not saying, I know you're not saying what I maybe accused you of there, is that may be a harsh term, but I think that if you're thinking that you live in a world of duality where you're going to get a certain kind of cause and effect, then it's not going to happen for you.
Right.
That's really clear, and maybe it takes the study of these kinds of things to come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
On the other hand, having read Sartre, at least anyway, you know, that when you do get up, you have to make a decision. And people make decisions and they pay heavy, heavy prices for making certain kinds of moral decisions.
Yep.
In fact, they go into it knowing that they're going to have to pay a heavy price for it. But I think that that's what defines us as
Yeah.
having a heroic life as opposed to whatever, you know, instead of being in the milieu.
Yeah. You know, I mean, and listen, in some ways, though, in some ways, there could be nothing farther apart than, you know, existentialism and Kabbalah. There actually is something that resonates with what you're saying, and that I meant to write out and to share it, but I did not do that. Shoot. So, but I'll just say this, that in terms of like having to wake up and make a decision, in some ways, the Kabbalah is like the greatest exemplification of that idea. Because if you wake up and you realize that you are part of the larger existence of the divine in the world, then that's really the realization of the very greatest responsibility that we could possibly have. So there's a note in the beginning of this chapter that this is what I was going to share with you. And some of you have heard me teach this through the Kedushat Levi, we can look at a midrash for the same idea. So David says, Adonai is my shadow at my right hand. And then there's a whole midrash and this whole literature that says, what does it mean that God is my shadow? Well, what it means is that we down below, we in the realm of Malchut, are the ones who can stir up the supernal forces. So put differently, the reason that the Psalm says, that King David said, God is my shadow, is because when I'm compassionate in the world, that causes, so to speak, God to be compassionate in the world. When I'm cruel or insensitive in the world, that causes, so to speak, God to be cruel. So God follows us like a shadow. And the Kabbalah imposes on us that responsibility in saying that we are not separate from God, but rather in the sphere of Malchut, we are part of the divine creation. We realize our unbelievable responsibility, our almost immeasurable, incalculable responsibility, because there's part of us that is part of God, and therefore, when we're asleep at the wheel and we're not paying attention, or when we're looking for reward, or when we're being selfish, we're preventing God from being fully operative in the world. And so, Lenny, I don't know why, but there was something something you said in quoting Sartre that resonates to me with this early midrashic idea that in fact the responsibility for the entire world lays with us. So I totally affirm that basic teaching. Okay. Anne, did you have a comment? You're muted.
I don't know if it's a different reading or just a different take, but I don't think that I will be gracious to those that I will be gracious to, and compassionate to those I will be compassionate to, necessarily has to make us feel like God is capricious and that nothing we do matters. I kind of read it to mean you can't know why the people
Right.
that I'm gracious to. It's outside of your ability to know.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're off the hook.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good response to Joel's earlier comment. I think that's a better way to say it. It's not that it's capricious, it's that to us it appears capricious because of our limited understanding, and that brings us back to the unknowability of Keter, right? I think that's a good way to say it. Okay, let me go now to give me 1 second just to get my ducks in a row here and see which text I want to share with you now. Okay, well, I guess we'll we'll go here. So one of the things that he says very specifically, he says that that when the Torah uses the phrase or the idea of God's face or the light of God's face, that it is referring to the power of Keter to bring its compassion and forgiveness and mercy and goodness into the world. So there are just many phrases, in the Yotzer prayer, we say, Kiv or penecha natata lanu Adonai Eloheinu, God, through the light of your face, you've given us the Torah. And principally, and this is what his extended reflection is based on the Birkat HaKohanim. Because in the Birkat HaKohanim, we say, Yevarechacha Hashem v'yishmerecha, Ye'er Adonai, Ye'er Hashem panav elecha, may God's light shine upon you, what it really means, Ye'er Adonai panav, may God shine the light of God's face unto you. And he says that is a reflection of Keter. And excuse me, not a reflection. That's an allusion to Keter. That Keter has succeeds in these moments in flowing its compassionate and forgiving light into the world. And in our liturgy and in our texts, when it refers to the light of the face, it's referring to Keter. Because sometimes Keter is likened to God's face, sometimes, which we can't really look at. No man sees my face and lives, from the Torah. And so I'm sharing that with you because there are certain moments in our services where we refer to God's face or the light of God's face. And it's nice for you to know that the Kabbalists refer to that as, see that as an expression of Keter operative in the world. Okay. Okay. Now, I want to shift gears and close on something we did talk about last time, but I want to make sure that we really delve into it. Okay, and that is where'd it go? Okay. Alrighty. All right. Who would like to read here where it says this Sephira? Somebody who hasn't had a chance to read yet?
I'll read.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This Sephira is known in the Torah as Ein.
Ein.
Ein. You must know that because of the great hiddenness of this Sephira and its being concealed from all creation, that no one can comprehend it, but only hear it, as we have written above.
Okay, so now again, we read this last time, but it's so essential that I want to go back into it. So the name, one of the names for Keter is Ein or Ayin, same letters, Aleph, Yud, Nun. Okay, that means it means nothing. It literally means nothing or nowhere. Okay. Okay, keep going.
Therefore, it is called Ein Yesh.
No, keep going. Read the whole phrase.
Yesh Hashem among us, or Ein.
Okay, so let's look at this. It's actually I should have written it as or ayin. So it's a little hard without the Hebrew. So let's look at this. What does that say? Exodus 17:7. Okay, so let's look at this real quick.
Nope, too far.
Okay, are you looking at the Torah text now?
Yeah.
Okay, so he's quoting this verse from Exodus. Vayikra Shem Makom Masa Umeriva Ariv Bnei Yisrael Al Nesotam et Hashem lemor hayesh Hashem b'kirbeno im ayin. So the place was called Masa Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tried the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord present among us or not?" Okay, so this is when the Israelites are on their way out of Egypt and they have a disagreement at Masa and Meribah, and they're all freaking out, and they need water, and they quarrel with Moses, and it says that they said, "Hayesh Adonai b'kirbeno im ayin." Now, if we look at this little passage through the eyes of the Kabbalah, it has a completely different verse that you can only understand if you take it out of context. Okay, remember that one of the names for Chokhmah is Yesh, which here means, you see this first word, Ha Yesh, that means the letter Hey is essentially turns this into a question. But the way the Kabbalists are reading this is Yesh Adonai, so Chokhmah Adonai among us im ayin, which is the pshat is God present among us or not? But the way that he reads it in his book is something like that he's reading it as Chokhmah and ayin. So Chokhmah and Keter are among us. So Yesh is Chokhmah, and that means there is. Ayin means nothing. Chokhmah means the beginning of existence, and Keter is called ayin or ain, meaning nothing. Okay, so let's keep reading, and then we'll circle back to that. Okay, keep going.
They are the secret of the two upper Sefirot that are together in the letter Yod of the blessed name.
So in what way are Keter and Chokhmah together in Yud? Can anybody explain that to us? Do you remember that? So if we go back to the diagramming the four-letter name of God, Yud, He, Vav, He, remember that the way that the Kabbalists put the 10 Sfirot on that is that the first Yud, the tip of the Yud, represents Keter, the body of the Yud represents Chokhmah, the letter He represents Bina, the letter Vav represents Tiferet, and the last letter He represents Malchut. So he's saying Chokhmah and Keter are together in the letter Yud. Okay, keep going.
You must know, now also know?
Yeah, probably.
You must now also know the true hidden meaning of from ayin Chokhmah comes.
Okay, pause. We're going to look at the Job. So from ayin, Chokhmah comes. Job 28:12. 28:12. 1 second. Job 28:12. Let's look at this. Whoops. Okay. V'ha-chokhmah me'ayin timatzeh, which is usually understood to be from where does wisdom come, or from where can wisdom be found? But he's reading it as Chokhmah comes from ayin. Chokhmah comes from Keter. Okay, which, let me zoom you out to see what we're talking about. Chokhmah is the beginning of existence. It comes from ayin. It comes from Keter. But Keter is known as nothing. Why is Keter, let me just pause and ask you, why is Keter known as nothing? Any ideas? Joel is saying something wise, but I can't hear him because his mute's on.
We can't comprehend it. It's above our.
Right.
We just don't get it.
Right. One of the ways of understanding that, one of the ways of understanding the word nothing is that it's just beyond our comprehension. There's nothing that we can refer to that would allow us to understand it. Right. And therefore we call it ayin. There's just nothing that we have any experience or concept of that can be used to allow us to begin to describe Keter, and therefore it's called nothing. So it's fascinating that the source of all that there is in the Kabbalah, the source of everything that's constantly animating the world is nothingness, right? It's nothing is at the heart of everything. I'm not saying that to try to sound mysterious or profound. It's just what the Kabbalah is trying to say. Um, and when we say nothing, it doesn't mean literally no thing. It means that nothing that we could ever possibly describe, nothing that is likened to anything in this world, nothing that we could call a thing, is at the heart of all of creation. Okay, so from nothing, Chokhmah, which is the foundation of creation, comes. Okay, keep going.
You need to see it.
Oh, fair enough. Okay. This is the inner meaning.
No, okay. This is the inner meaning of the yud of the name from the revelation of the supernal boundary. Know that because the world is judged with harsh sentences on account of the many transgressions and sins, people need to quickly grasp this in order to bring about healing for every wound and illness. This is as the verse says, Shir Lamalot, I lift my eyes to the mountains. From Ayin will my help come.
Okay, so we're going to close by looking at this verse again. Oopsie.
I always thought that meant my help will come from the Lord.
Exactly. Well, we're going to look closely at that. So check this out. 121:1. Okay, so oops. Shir Lamalot, which actually works really well here, because remember that he's describing the tree of life as an ascending from Malchut to Keter. So Lamalot means ascents, many aliyahs. So a song of ascents. Esa inai, I lift or I turn my eyes, El Haharim, to the mountains. And this is the only phrase he really cares about in this verse. May ayin yavo ezri, which colloquially means exactly what they've translated as, from where will my help come? So the word ayin is multivalent. But if you read it overly literally, so you totally deconstruct its meaning, it means from nothing, Yavo Ezri. Like ultimately, the all blessing, all healing, all forgiveness, that at its root, it's something that comes from beyond the created world. It's this thing that we call, this energy that we call Keter, that we can't describe or put any name on or compare to anything, but there's something that's flowing into the world that comes from nothing, and that is where our help comes from. So I guess I'm offering that to you because as though we cannot ascend to Keter in our consciousness, I think it's in our prayer or our meditation, trying to rise above as we target our prayers, as we summon a kavanah an awareness in our minds as to what it is that we're praying to or praying for. There's something that is like at the fount of all creation that we can't name, we can't describe, we can't conceive of, but something that's constantly bringing life and healing and blessing and mercy into the world. And trying to elevate our minds to that as much as we can, to try to tap into that source of constant, unending rachamim and mercy, is something that I think can really help heal us. And significantly, as we go into the teshuvah of the high holidays, to know that we're drawing on that, because that is the source of all teshuvah. That's the source of all teshuvah. I'm going to close there and see if there are any questions, and then we have sort of a logistical question to address. Brad, you're muted.
Yeah, I was just going to say where we ended up here seems to me to relate back to where we were speaking of the frustration of the futility of our existence, in that no matter how much good we do, it doesn't seem to do us any. We don't seem to get back a reward, or
Mhm.
at least not in a logical
Mhm.
progression.
Right.
And I think what you were just talking about, and I was going to ask about earlier, is that there are moments, it seems, in our lives when we transcend that mortal kind of trap, and when we understand for a moment, or we can glimpse uh, the reward uh, for doing as we are supposed to, for following God's laws. And we seem to understand that. And then later, for some reason, we're back in our mortal existence, and it evades us again.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and that's very, I mean, very familiar to, in my experience, is that sometimes there's the sense of order, and it makes sense to us, and the world seems filled with blessing. And then when we're out of that consciousness, it's hard to even, you can't remember what it was like to sense that. Right. I mean, I think one of the ways of,
Well, I
yeah, I
think
mean,
fasting and prayer helps.
right. That's right.
Really, it sounds simple, but
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, for me, it's a jagged and confused path, and there's no
Yeah.
consistent answer, but at least in my experience. But I will say that, yes, I mean, I think ultimately the goal is, I guess maybe closing on the question Mickey raised is a good one, because it's such an important question. Look, we're never going to get to the point where, and even as we say it, we understand that we wouldn't want to, but to get to the point where we see material blessings for all the good things and punishments for all the bad things, right? We all understand that that at the heart of divine service is moving beyond self-interest, and so we don't want to view the world like a snack machine where, like, I put in something
Yeah.
and I get something out. But I think that the Kabbalists really do, when they talk about blessing and goodness and happiness and joy that comes from divine service, they're quite serious. But the challenge is, though, that when the higher up if we can challenge ourselves, or we're able to ascend higher up the spherotic ladder out of the realm of ego, then no matter what happens, we see it as goodness, right? Which
Yeah.
is another way of saying we don't get to determine that, like, a life of blessing means I get an air conditioner, or there's a sale at at Sears or whatever it is. But we begin to see at the core of everything that is, there is blessing, no matter how it falls out in our lives. And that's an extremely high level of consciousness, easy to say, and extraordinarily difficult to get there. But I'm mentioning that because the Kabbalists really do imagine a world of reward, but it's not reward according to our ego's definition. It's being able to see that Keter is, no matter what happens to me down here, Keter is constantly showering rachamim and blessing and goodness into the world.
Yeah.
So, okay, now here's the deal. I feel like a Joel, and then I'm going to close this off.
So two things. One, I mean, that kind of goes back to that original statement of I'll be good to those who I'm good to.
Yeah.
And the fact that, yes, it's limiting, but the main message is there's really no rhyme or reason. Like the other person kind of pointed it out. It's I'll be good to those that I'm good, and compassionate to those that I'm compassionate to, but don't expect it to happen all the time. The other thing was I kind of want to go back, and I don't know if I had missed it from a long time ago, but maybe there's some sort of reference sheet or something with all of the God's names and the letters and the yud and the crowns.
Yeah.
I don't have a place where I could. It's very visual, but I don't have anything. I don't have any visual aids to help me with that.
Yeah. So
I wasn't sure if
Oh,
there's something that you could kind of
what's
give
Sarah
us as a
holding up?
handout or something like that.
Sarah, what are you holding up?
The thing is I bought, there are a lot of cards available online that are laminated with, and I could not remember the name of the spheres, so I needed something. But I sent you an email, and I haven't heard back, so I don't know if you got it or saw it, that said, I went to Chikatiya's book, and I looked up that very thing that you mentioned, Joel, and I began to make a list, but I know it's not complete. And when Rabbi said, and this name, and this name, and this one means this, and this one, I had the same question. How do I gather the names? Because until you mentioned it, Rabbi, I didn't realize that one of the prayers we say on a regular basis actually is addressed to a different name that I never realized was being addressed to God. I want more awareness like that.
Right.
So I second whatever Joel is asking.
Well, okay, so yeah, I mean, I think I would say a couple things. First of all, the very best way is to go through his book and to look at all of the names, right? Now, what I can do if I have a little time, and I don't have time right now because, and that's probably why you haven't heard back from me with your email. I apologize, but in
Right.
pre-high holidays, I'm just buried. But in the back of the version that I have, of the Hebrew version that I have, on the very last page of each chapter, he just lists the names that each of the Sefirot is known by, that according to Chikatilia. I could eventually, after the holidays, transliterate this for you, so you have all of the names. So just, really quickly, I'll just give you an example. So he says, I'm looking at the last page of chapter 10 of my edition. It says, Ehyeh, Ayin, Keter, Mizrach Elyon, which means the supernal east, Mazel Elyon, the upper Mazel, Makor Elyon, the source of the supernal source, Chesed HaElyon, the supernal Chesed, et cetera, et cetera. There's like 15 names that Keter is known by. But Joel, I think you were also asking for something beyond that. I think you were referring to this, among other things,
Yes.
yeah. So I guess I don't have any quick answer. These things exist out there in the world. I could eventually compile all of these things and share them with the class, these little diagrams and stuff like that. And I also recommend what Sarah just shared with you, that resource.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry that I don't have a kind of ready-made. Okay, here's what I want to say. I would like to do one more class. The timing of this is perfect because Keter actually really meshes with the high holidays and the 13 attributes of God. And that's something we didn't talk about so much this time, but I feel like we need one more lesson on Keter to complete the chapter on Keter and to complete the book. And I think doing that before Rosh Hashanah would be perfect. That would work well for our next class, except that I'm going to not be here for our next class. And I'm going to be out of town. The next class is on the 2 Mondays from now, but I'm going to be gone then. So I'm wondering if that Thursday, which would be that would be the 17th. I wonder if people could do a makeup class on that day.
What time? Noon?
Yeah, I guess noon.
So instead of the 14th.
Correct. The 17th instead of the 14th of September. Does that work? That's like right before Rosh Hashanah.
It does for me.
Raise your hand if you would be there for that. Okay, so let's carve that in stone. One second, let me just put it in my. And when we shifted to this new mode of doing every 2 weeks and kind of doing a few sessions per Sephira, we didn't know that it was going to work out this well, but to end with Keter just before Rosh Hashanah is actually really, really perfect. So we'll do Thursday, the 17th of September, Last Gates of Light class at noon. Okay?
In closing, can I show you something?
Yeah.
I opened up an email today I get a lot of emails talking about what to prepare for Rosh Hashanah Yom Tov meals. And today I got one from a magazine called Fleischig. Fleischig, have you ever heard of that?
No.
But I want you to see the name of the company. Can you see it?
Purple Crane. That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Okay, team.
And I
Thank you
have-
so much.
Thank
Have a
Bye,
beautiful
everybody.
day.
Rabbi, I just want to ask you to make sure that the time change gets out to the community, because everybody who comes to this class isn't here today.
Oh, when is the time change?
Well, we're going to change it for, the class, the day of the class is going to change.
Oh, gotcha. Right.
And that information needs to go out to people. So
Good call. I'll send an email to the office right now. Okay,
Thanks.
thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.